What if the strongest part of you is the one you've spent your entire life hiding? What if the piece of yourself you've tried to bury, the side you've been told is too much, too sensitive, too intense, is the very thing that was meant to save you? Let me ask you this. How many times have you swallowed your truth just to keep the peace? How many times have you forgiven someone who didn't deserve it, stayed quiet when you wanted to scream, or bent yourself into shapes you can't even recognize anymore? All because you didn't want to hurt someone else. If you're honest, you already know the cost. Nights where you lie awake replaying conversations in your mind. The sting of realizing that your kindness was mistaken for weakness. The exhaustion of carrying everyone's burdens while wondering if anyone will ever carry yours. And yet, you keep giving. You keep showing up. You keep hoping that maybe this time, someone will see you. Not just the smile, not just the helpfulness, but the depth, the fire, the quiet strength that waits beneath the surface. But what happens when the empath, the one who feels everything so deeply, finally reaches their breaking point? What happens when the very person everyone thought could be bent forever finally snaps? Carl Jung warned us about this moment. He called it the confrontation with the shadow, the meeting with the part of yourself that you've been taught to fear, but which holds the very key to your wholeness. And when an empath reaches this point, when they stop suppressing their shadow and instead integrate it, something extraordinary is born. Not fragility, not bitterness, but a kind of power that is both terrifying and liberating. To understand this, we need to talk about masks. Imagine for a moment that every person you meet is wearing one. At work, at family gatherings, even in friendships, people wear masks to survive. Masks of politeness, masks of confidence, masks of control. Jung called this the persona, the part of us designed to make us acceptable to society. But behind that mask, another part waits. The shadow. Everything we hide, repress, or deny about ourselves. For most people, the shadow stays unconscious, leaking out in small bursts of anger, envy, or resentment. But for empaths, it's different. Because empaths live closer to the edges of human experience. They don't just sense their own emotions, they absorb the emotions of everyone around them. They become mirrors for the pain others refuse to face. And while society often praises this as compassion, what few realize is how much it costs the empath to hold that mirror day after day. Every lie they've caught but stayed silent about, every manipulation they've endured, every time they've been told, "You're too sensitive," all of it gets stored, layer upon layer in the unconscious. The shadow grows heavy, not with rage, but with unexpressed truth. And here's where the danger lies. Because Jung warned that the shadow cannot stay buried forever. Push it down long enough and it doesn't simply disappear, it gathers force. He called this the return of the repressed. The empath who has been quiet, accommodating, endlessly patient. When the dam finally breaks, what emerges is not the fragile creature everyone expected, but a force of nature. To make this real, let's use a story. Picture a bridge, old and worn, standing over a river. For years, storms have battered it, winds have shaken it, but still it stands. People walk across it daily, never realizing how much strain it's under. Then one day, without warning, a single extra weight is placed on it, and the bridge doesn't crack slowly. It snaps all at once. The collapse isn't about that final step. It's about everything the bridge has been holding silently for years. That is what happens when an empath snaps. The collapse isn't destruction, it's revelation. You see, Jung believed that transformation doesn't begin in comfort. It begins in crisis. He wrote about Enantiodromia, the idea that when something is pushed to its extreme, it eventually turns into its opposite. Endless patience becomes immovability. Boundless forgiveness becomes unshakable clarity. The one who gave without limits becomes fiercely protective of their energy. The empath who was once everyone's safe harbor becomes the storm no one expected. And yet, here's the paradox. This snapping isn't cruelty. It's not revenge. It's truth. Because when the empath awakens, when they stop suppressing their shadow and begin to integrate it, they don't become less loving. They become more discerning. They don't stop caring. They start caring wisely. They don't lose their softness. They gain a spine. And that is what narcissists, manipulators, and emotional predators fear most. Not the empath's tears, but their transformation. But why does this happen? Why is it the empath, of all people, who carries this destiny of shadow and light? Jung believed that some people are forced into individuation, the journey toward wholeness, much earlier than others. While most drift through life wearing their masks, empaths are confronted daily with emotional contradictions that demand resolution. They feel pain intensely, yet they still hope. They see deception clearly, yet they continue to believe in goodness. They hold opposites in their hands every single day, and that crucible forces them to grow. What others spend a lifetime avoiding, the empath faces head-on, often through betrayal. Think back to the moments in your life that changed you most. Were they moments of comfort or moments of crisis? Chances are it was the betrayal that woke you up, the heartbreak that made you stronger, the silence that taught you to hear your own voice. That is the path of the empath. Pain becomes the catalyst for rebirth, and here is where Jung's darkest warning comes alive. He wrote that the most dangerous individuals are not those who act out of unhealed wounds, but those who have confronted their wounds, integrated them, and emerged whole. Because nothing external can control someone who has mastered their own shadow. The empath who has walked through fire, endured manipulation, and survived betrayal doesn't just return to who they were before, they become something new, something sovereign. They are no longer a mirror for others' projections. They become a mirror of truth. If you've ever felt like your sensitivity was your curse, if you've ever been told you're too much, if you've ever wondered whether your empathy is secretly destroying you, listen carefully. That sensitivity is not weakness. It is advanced pattern recognition. It is a form of intelligence that most people can't even comprehend. You notice the inconsistencies others gloss over. You detect the lies hidden in polite smiles. You sense what others try so hard to conceal. That is your gift. But here is the warning. If you never integrate your shadow, if you keep giving without boundaries, if you keep silencing yourself just to preserve the illusion of peace, that gift will turn against you. It will drain you, break you, and leave you hollow. The day the empath snaps is the day they realize that empathy without boundaries is self-destruction. It is the day they stop confusing love with sacrifice, compassion with self-erasure, patience with passivity. And when that day comes, they don't just reclaim their power, they become untouchable. So let me leave you with this thought. What if the pain you've been running from isn't your enemy, but your invitation? What if the shadow you've been taught to fear is the very key to your freedom? Jung believed that within every wound lies the seed of transformation. And maybe, just maybe, the very moment you fear snapping is the moment you finally awaken. The moment you begin to glimpse your own shadow, the world itself starts to look different. You realize that what you once thought of as kindness was often compliance. What you called loyalty was sometimes fear of abandonment. What you believed was forgiveness was, in truth, the inability to hold your own boundaries. It is a painful awakening, because it means looking in the mirror and seeing not just the mask you've shown the world, but also the face beneath, the face you've hidden even from yourself. Carl Jung taught that every human being carries this duality: the persona, the mask we wear to be accepted, and the shadow, the repressed self we pretend isn't there. For most people, the persona is thin and the shadow is shallow. They hide a bit of envy, a little anger, perhaps an unspoken desire. But for empaths, the shadow grows far more complex because their very survival has depended on suppressing so much. They've learned to dim their truth so others don't feel threatened, to silence their instincts so they won't be called paranoid, to endure cruelty while smiling, because to speak would invite even more cruelty. And so their shadow is not just anger or envy. It is an entire reservoir of unlived power. Imagine it like a deep underground spring. For years, you keep piling rocks over it, telling yourself it's safer that way. Each betrayal adds another stone. Each manipulation adds another layer. You cover it with politeness, with self-sacrifice, with phrases like, "It's fine," or "Don't worry about me." But the water doesn't stop flowing just because you've hidden it. It builds pressure. It pushes against the stones, and one day it bursts through, unstoppable. That eruption is not destruction. It is the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming whole. This is why betrayal hits empaths harder than most. When someone violates your trust, it doesn't just wound you in the present. It reopens every unhealed wound of the past. It calls forth all the stones you've used to cover your spring. And in that flood of feeling, you're faced with a choice. Suppress it again and drown slowly in your own silence, or confront it and begin the most terrifying journey a human being can take, the descent into the shadow. But here is where most people misunderstand. They imagine the shadow as some monstrous side of us, filled only with rage and destruction. And yes, it contains those things. But Jung insisted that the shadow also contains what is most vital, most alive, most necessary for our wholeness. For the empath, the shadow does not only hold anger, it holds boundaries. It holds the ability to say no without apology. It holds the wisdom to walk away, the courage to stand firm, the clarity to refuse manipulation. It holds the very qualities you've been told would make you unlovable, but which are, in fact, the source of your strength. And this is why the day the empath snaps is so misunderstood. Outsiders see only the shift in behavior, the patience that suddenly becomes refusal, the forgiveness that suddenly becomes distance, the listening ear that suddenly falls silent. They call it coldness. They call it selfishness. They say, "You've changed." But what has really happened is not the loss of empathy. It is its refinement. Your love is no longer scattered like seeds on barren soil. It is planted only where it can grow. This is the turning point where the empath begins to live from psychological precision instead of emotional reactivity. You stop explaining yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you. You stop rescuing people who thrive in their own chaos. You stop mistaking exhaustion for devotion. In Jung's terms, you begin to move from unconscious reaction to conscious choice. And conscious choice is what makes you untouchable. Manipulators depend on predictable patterns. They rely on your guilt, your compassion, your need to be understood. They bait you with half apologies, draw you into endless explanations, entangle you in cycles of blame and forgiveness. But when you awaken to your shadow, when you stop playing the role they expect, their entire game collapses. Because you no longer need to win the argument. You no longer need their approval. You no longer need their love to feel whole. That detachment, born not of indifference but of deep understanding, is what Jung called psychological autonomy. Think of it this way. If someone hands you a poisoned cup and you refuse to drink, they lose all power over you. For years, you may have swallowed what others offered, criticism, manipulation, disrespect, telling yourself it was love. But the moment you put the cup down, not in anger but in clarity, everything changes. You are no longer participating in your own diminishment. That is the empath's revolution. But of course, this revolution does not come without cost. To embrace your shadow is to shatter illusions, not just about others, but about yourself. You have to confront the part of you that needed to be needed, the part that believed love must be earned through sacrifice, the part that felt safer rescuing others than facing your own loneliness. Jung warned that individuation requires a descent into the underworld of the psyche, a confrontation with everything you've avoided. This is not comfortable work. It feels like dying, because in a sense, it is. The old self, the compliant self, the endlessly accommodating self, cannot survive the fire. But what emerges from that fire is something extraordinary. Nietzsche once said, "One must have chaos within to give birth to a dancing star." The empath who integrates their shadow becomes that star, not because they are unscarred, but because they have turned their scars into light. They do not harden into bitterness. They refine into discernment. They do not stop loving. They begin loving in alignment with truth. This is why awakened empaths are so rare and so powerful. They are no longer trapped in the cycle of reaction, no longer seeking validation, no longer blind to patterns. They have become conscious participants in their own destiny. And once you reach this place, there is no going back. The mask is gone. The illusions are gone. All that remains is authenticity. And authenticity is the most terrifying force in the world for those who live on deception. So ask yourself, how many times in your life have you known the truth but silenced it? How many times have you felt the manipulation in your bones but gave the benefit of the doubt? How many times have you seen the pattern but hoped, against all evidence, that this time would be different? Every one of those moments has been an invitation to stop betraying yourself in the name of peace, an invitation to stop carrying everyone else's shadows while ignoring your own, an invitation to awaken. Because the real danger is not that you feel too much. The real danger is that you suppress too much, that you keep burying your truth until one day the eruption is so great you no longer recognize yourself. The work Jung calls us to is not the denial of our sensitivity, but its transformation. To recognize that empathy without discernment is self-sabotage. To understand that love without boundaries is not love, but dependency. To embrace that saying no is not cruelty, but clarity. And this brings us to Jung's deepest insight: individuation, the process of becoming whole. For most people, this is a slow, hesitant journey, often avoided entirely. But for the empath, betrayal accelerates it. Pain becomes the fire that burns away illusion. In facing your shadow, you discover your spine. In confronting your wounds, you discover your wisdom. In losing the people who never truly saw you, you finally begin to see yourself. And when that happens, something inside you shifts forever. You no longer crave being chosen, because you have chosen yourself. You no longer beg to be understood, because you understand yourself. You no longer cling to what is breaking you, because you finally trust your own wholeness. This is not arrogance. It is sovereignty, the quiet knowing that your worth is not up for negotiation. And it is here, at this threshold, that the narcissist, the manipulator, the predator, faces their greatest fear, because their power was never in their cruelty, it was in your compliance. Their control was never in their strength, it was in your silence. The moment you awaken, the moment you integrate your shadow and stand whole, the game ends, and nothing terrifies them more than a player who has stepped off the board entirely. So the question becomes, what will you do with this awakening? Will you retreat back into silence, convincing yourself it's safer to keep the mask? Or will you step into the fire, confront your shadow, and discover the force of nature that has always been waiting within you? Because Jung warned us, what you do not make conscious will rule you from the shadows. And for the empath, the cost of staying unconscious is nothing less than your soul. And then there comes a silence. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence after the storm, when the air is clear and the ground is washed clean. This silence belongs to the empath who has walked through fire and emerged whole. The silence of someone who no longer needs to explain, no longer needs to prove, no longer needs to chase. It is the silence of sovereignty. Carl Jung believed that this was the true goal of every human life: to become whole, to individuate, to integrate both light and shadow into a self that is no longer divided. For the empath, this journey is not theoretical. It is lived. It is written into their very wounds. Every betrayal, every disappointment, every manipulation has been a step in this descent and a step toward this rebirth. But what does life look like on the other side? What happens after the empath snaps? After the illusions are shattered? After the shadow has been embraced? It is not a life without feeling. It is not a retreat into coldness or apathy. No, it is something far more radical. It is the ability to feel everything without being destroyed by anything. The first step is a sacred pause. For perhaps the first time in your life, you stop rushing to fix, to explain, to soothe. You allow the space between stimulus and response to widen. You sit with your discomfort, your anger, your grief, and instead of running from them, you listen. You recognize that these emotions are not enemies to be silenced, but messengers carrying the truth of your boundaries, your needs, your worth. And in that pause, you discover something extraordinary. You are not your reaction. You are the awareness that chooses. From this awareness comes the second step, the reclaiming of your number. For years, you may have believed that saying no was selfish, unkind, even unlovable. But now you see that every no is also a yes, to yourself, to your health, to your authenticity. Boundaries are not walls, they are doors. And when you begin to honor them, you realize that your empathy is no longer drained by those who take without giving. It flows toward those who can hold it with respect. Your love becomes sacred again. The third step is the release of illusions. You stop chasing people who consistently run. You stop watering dead gardens. You stop trying to earn love from those incapable of giving it. This is perhaps the most painful part of the transformation, because it means grieving not only the people you've lost, but the person you used to be, the one who tolerated what was intolerable. But in this grief, you find liberation. You realize that letting go is not abandonment, it is alignment. And then comes the fourth step, the return to yourself. Jung called this the emergence of the self, the integrated whole that no longer needs masks or approval. Here, you begin to live from a place of clarity rather than fear. You trust your perceptions, not because they are infallible, but because you have learned through pain that doubting yourself is the quickest path to betrayal. You stop performing empathy for those who exploit it. You stop explaining your worth to those committed to misunderstanding it. You stop apologizing for your needs as if they were burdens. You know who you are, and that knowing is enough. This is the moment when the empath becomes untouchable, not because nothing can hurt them, but because nothing can control them. They may still feel deeply, they may still love fiercely, but now they choose where their energy flows. Their empathy is no longer a reflex, it is a conscious gift. And in that choice lies their power. Think of the manipulator who once thrived on your reactions. They depended on your guilt, your explanations, your endless attempts to fix what they were never willing to change. But now, when they try to provoke you, they are met not with argument, but with stillness, not with begging, but with silence, not with reactivity, but with clarity. And in that moment, the dynamic collapses. Their power was never real. It was borrowed from your compliance. And when you withdraw that compliance, the illusion shatters. This is why Jung said that the greatest victory is not conquering others, but conquering yourself. The empath who has integrated their shadow no longer seeks revenge because they have already won the only battle that matters, the battle against their own unconscious patterns. They do not need to destroy the narcissist because they have already dismantled the hooks that made them susceptible. They no longer play the game, and therefore the game ends. But perhaps the most beautiful part of this transformation is what it does to your capacity to love. You don't become colder, you become warmer, but with precision. You no longer scatter your compassion recklessly, you channel it wisely. You no longer seek to heal those who wound you, you walk beside those who honor you. You no longer confuse self-sacrifice with love. You discover that the deepest love is one that includes yourself. In this way, the awakened empath becomes a paradox. soft yet unshakable, compassionate yet discerning, open yet protected. They embody what Jung called appropriate response, no longer reacting from pain, but acting from clarity. They forgive, but they no longer forget. They feel deeply, but they no longer drown. They love fiercely, but they no longer abandon themselves in the process. And this, ultimately, is Jung's darkest warning and greatest promise. The empath who integrates their shadow becomes unstoppable, not because they dominate, but because they cannot be dominated. Not because they control others, but because they have mastered themselves. They are dangerous, not in their capacity to harm, but in their immunity to harm. They have turned their wounds into wisdom, their pain into power, their suffering into sovereignty. So if you are listening to this and you feel the stirrings of recognition, know this: your breaking point is not the end. It is the threshold. The day you snap is the day you awaken. The moment you stop betraying yourself is the moment you step into your wholeness. And from that place you will discover a life you never thought possible. A life where your empathy is no longer a burden, but a gift. A life where your boundaries are not barriers, but bridges. A life where your love is no longer wasted, but received. But this transformation is not automatic. It requires courage. It requires honesty. It requires the willingness to look into the darkest parts of yourself and find not only pain, but potential. Jung said, "In the shadow lies the gold." The question is, will you claim it? Because the world does not need more people who numb themselves to survive. The world needs awakened empaths. Those who have walked through fire, faced their shadow, and emerged whole. Those who can see deception yet choose truth. Those who can feel deeply yet remain unshakable. Those who can love fiercely yet never abandon themselves. And maybe that is you. Maybe that is why you are here listening now. Maybe life has been preparing you all along, not to stay broken, but to rise sovereign. Not to live in silence, but to speak with clarity. Not to keep giving yourself away, but to finally stand in the fullness of who you are. So here is my invitation. If this message resonates, if you felt something awaken within you as you listened, then don't let it fade when the video ends. Comment below what part struck you the most. Share this with someone who still believes empathy is weakness. Subscribe so you don't miss the next step in this journey, because this is not just content. It is a movement of empaths who are ready to rise, to reclaim their power, to become whole. Because the day the empath snaps is not the day they break. It is the day they awaken. And when they do, they don't just change themselves. They change everything around them. And perhaps in that awakening lies the hope for all of us.